Welcome back to the Foundation in C# course. We are currently in Module 7, and this lesson we're going to be covering Windows Forms or Win Forms. And this is one that typically, if you're taking a course in college or maybe even some tutorials online, this is the first project type they'll give you. And it's not the first that I gave you. In fact, we're 7 modules in before you even get to this project type. And that's by design. So let's look at why that is, what Windows Forms are, and how to use them. Let's go to Visual Studio. We're going to create a new project. And we're going to select the Windows Form project. So from Platform, we're going to go Windows. And the project type is going to be Desktop. And WPF is at the top, but if we scroll down here, we have a couple of different options: Windows Forms App .NET Framework and Windows Forms App .NET Core. Now, typically, I have said that if you have the option, use .NET Core. But since the .NET Core version of the Windows Form Designer is not quite done yet, we're going to go with the Windows Framework, .NET Framework version of Windows Form App. The differences are minor, and since I want to show you both anyways, and you'll see WPF in .NET Core, I think this is just fine. So we'll hit Next, and we're going to call this the Message Wall app. So Message Wall and Message Wall app for the solution name. And we'll do .NET Framework 4.8. We'll hit Create. And once this gets created, we'll see our first Windows Form project. Notice it says Form 1. Just like it says Class 1, we create a class library. It says Form 1. We need to rename this, but we don't want to delete it. With class libraries, we delete them and restart. However, it's a little more complicated with Windows Forms. So we're just going to rename. So if you click again on this file, it will allow you to change it. We're going to change this to be, let's just call it Dashboard. And hit Enter. We're going to get this pop-up box here that says, you are renaming a file. Would you also like to perform a rename in this project of all references to the code element Form 1? Why, yes, I would. Because what that will do is it will rename the class that's behind this, which we're going to see in just a minute. So this is a Windows Form application. If I just hit Start with doing nothing else, I'm just going to hit Start. And once I run this, it's going to pop up with this form window. And there we go. There's our form window. We can grow it, we can shrink it, we can move it around. We have the minimize button, the maximize button, and the close button. It says Form 1, and it has a little icon here. The icon has a menu on it for things including move, size, minimize, maximize, and close. These are all basic Windows controls. And if I close, it closes out the application. Now, the reason why this is the first project type a lot of tutorials would teach you is because it's just so easy. Just by creating the project, we already have a working application. We have something on the screen that's visual. What's even more tempting is we have this toolbox over here, and in the common controls, we have things like buttons and labels and text boxes. And in fact, all you need to do is click and drag to bring a button onto the screen, and click and drag to bring a text box onto the screen, and click and drag to bring a label onto the screen, and even align it with the text box. And that just seems so simple. And so now we have a form with some stuff on it, a button that's clickable. Oops. And I go, what was that? I don't know. Let's go back to where we were. And I keep going. And I start on this, and if I run this, I now have this form, and I can type in here, and I can click the button. Nothing happens, but I can click it, and I've got the label here. And this is what you initially see as a win, because it's very easy to do. You can even drag other things on here as well. Notice the common controls have quite a few things, But then under all Windows forms, there's a lot more stuff you can add. You can add tab controls and tooltips and tracker bars and all the rest. But what have we actually done? How does this work? And the answer typically when you first start off is, I don't know, which I equate to magic. I don't know why it works, it just works. It just happens, and that's magic. And I really don't like magic because what happens when the magic breaks? So somehow over here I see this window, and I see this code right here. That doesn't look right. I don't want that code. So if I delete this, I say, you know what, just get rid of that. Come back over here, and all of a sudden this happens. And I got this big nasty message. I haven't even done anything yet. Why are you yelling at me? And it's yelling at you, and you don't know why, but the magic has broken. And you say, well, I know a solution for this. We're going to close everything out and open up the form again. But it's still there. So maybe you restart Visual Studio, and it's still there. And what's happened is the magic has broken. And unless you know how to fix the magic, you don't know what to do. And the most common solution is delete your project and start over and hope that it doesn't happen again when you have more code in it. Well, we're going to go through what this magic is, how to fix this error and others, and how we can use Windows Forms to its full extent. So let's start by understanding what the Windows Form is. The Windows Form is actually two different classes. If you right-click on a form and say View Code or hit F7, you get this code right here. The code we just saw recently that we had some extra code in here we didn't know what was for. This is what's called the code behind. And this is the code behind the form. And it's a partial class. We haven't gone over partial classes yet because primarily the place you will see partial classes is in Windows Forms. The purpose and design for a partial class was to separate out display code from logic of the form itself. So this is form logic. This is the stuff that we normally control. And then there's display code. And display code is what makes this form look the way it does when it's actually visible. So that's the other part of our class. So what is this? Well, ignore the partial because the partial just means it's broken apart into two parts, but it's one class. And so the compiler just brings these two classes that are in two different spots, brings them back together, merges them, and then it calls it one class from then on as far as the build process goes. So it's just to help us as developers not see code that we shouldn't change. So public class. Well, we know what a class is, right? Public class dashboard. So the name of our class is dashboard, which just happens to correspond with what we named our form. Well, that's because a Windows form is just a class. And that right there is the magic. That's what we often miss, and what you miss if you have not learned about classes and instantiation and inheritance and interfaces and all those type of things that we learned earlier in object-oriented programming. Because that's what Windows forms are based upon, is just classes. Classes and class instances. That's what forms are. So this particular class is called dashboard. That's our form name. And so we give it that the class name. That's how it works. The form name is the class name. And it inherits from, notice the colon, it inherits from type form. So Microsoft created a Windows form class and said, okay, here's all the stuff that goes into a Windows form, things like that maximize button and the minimize button, and all that stuff, they put it into a class called form. And then said, whenever you create a class and inherit from form, now your class becomes a form. So remember the is a rule? Dashboard is a form. There we go. So if we hit F12 here, just kind of go down the rabbit hole. We're not going to look at the code, but we're going to look at the definitions for these things. Hit F12 on form. We get this. Public class form, and it has active form, allow transparency, maximum size, location, key press, all the rest of the stuff, and there's a lot of stuff. Okay? But then notice at the top, form inherits from container control. Well, hit F12 there. Container control has a lot of stuff. And that inherits from scrollable control, and it has an interface applied to it as well for container control. Let's look at scrollable control. Well, that's a control, but it also has three interfaces: I arrange element, I component, and I disposable. Partial class. How do you find this other half besides hitting F12 on initialize component? Well, if we expand out our form and see this dashboard.designer.cs, this is the other half of our class right here. And that's the partial class dashboard. There we go. And this is all the design stuff about our form. This is what is used by the drag and drop designer to keep track of what is on our form and where. And this is very clear about don't touch this. Do not modify the contents of this method with a code editor. Now we're going to, because rules are meant to be broken, and this is one of those cases. But this is generated code. Well, what generates it? What generates it is the drag and drop editor. What happens is Visual Studio essentially runs this class to render for us our form in the designer. And then when we drag things around or move things, it changes the properties and values of those items in this class. So notice button 1, text box 1, label 1. Do those sound familiar? I dragged three things onto the form: a button, a text box, and a label. That's what those three things are. Now notice it says this, which this just means this instance. So this instance of dashboard dot button 1. Okay, so that's a field or a variable. So this variable equals new. Does that look familiar? Sure does. We're instantiating a new class, a new system.windows.forms.button. So our button 1, which is our variable name, that variable holds an instance of the button class. So every time you drag a button onto your form, you're creating a class instance of that type, button. The same thing is true with text box and label. These are classes. That's what we're creating instances of when we drag on the form. Now, why is our form all wonky? Well, if you read the error message, and that's really important, especially anymore, it used to be the error messages were horrible. And if you ever create error messages, make sure they're clear. But Microsoft has gotten a lot better at making clear error messages. And the error message says the designer, remember dashboard.designer.cs? Designer cannot process unknown name button1 underscore click. Remember that thing we deleted? Pretty sure it said button1 underscore click. The code within the method initialize component is generated by the designer and should not be manually modified. Please remove any changes and try opening the designer again. So it thinks we manually modified the designer, but in fact we didn't. We modified the code behind this code and deleted a method we were using. But over here in the initialize component on line 44 where it said, that's this instance, button1, that's the variable name for our button instance, dot click. What's click? It's an event handler. So when someone clicks a button, it's going to fire off an event. An event just says, hey, this just happened. We can listen for that action with a method, and that's called an event handler. And so in this case, if we look at the click event, we're adding, so plus equals, adding to the click event, a new system.eventHandler, an event handler instance. And that instance was passing in this, meaning this instance, dot button click, button1 underscore click. What's that? Well, right now it's saying, I don't know. No clue what that is. Well, that was a method. So what happens with an event is if you have a method, you can pass it into this event handler and say, hey, this method, I want you to fire it whenever this happens. In this case, the click event. And so we had said this method, but we deleted this method from over here. So it's no longer there. It can't find that method. Therefore, we have an error. The solution is to delete that line. If we do that and save, we go to the designer, it's back as it was. Now what I had done to create that code is I double-clicked on button. Notice it now says private void button1 underscore click, and it has these two variables, or two parameters, inside of our method. And if we come back over here, that line is back. It now says button1 underscore click, but it's fine because we actually have a method called button1 underscore click. So what will happen is whenever the user clicks instance button1. So if I were to come over to the designer and I were to say, well, let's just do this. Let's just select this, Control C, Control V. Now I have button 2. I can move it around. Come back to the designer. Now I have button 2. But the click event is still only on button 1, not on button 2. There is no click event down here. So that's how we apply an event to one specific event on one specific instance of one thing. So in this case, the click event, we're going to assign this handler to that click event. Okay, I'm kind of belaboring this, but I want to make sure that it sinks in. The idea that it's not just I click on this and somehow magic happens and this method gets called. Nope, no magic. It's just that we wired up that method to that event. And that's it. Now, while we're here, let's look at the other items in this initialize component method. Let's stick with button 1 for right now. Button 1 has a location, and it's set as system.drawing.point 303264. Well, how'd that get set? Well, that got set because of where we dragged it onto the form. So 303264. If I come back over here, and I move it up here. Now it's 4435. That's because I moved it, and now it's, I believe it's the upper left-hand corner is what it's specifying. That's the position in pixels from the left and from the top. Okay, so if I were to set this at 0, 23, it moved the button, actually it shrunk the button down to nothing. There we go. I shrunk it back, or expanded it back out. Now it's 4435. Now it also has a name, and that name is button 1. That's a horrible name. Let's call it something else. Let's call it click me. And if I do that and go back over here, and I look at the, interesting, it doesn't show the click me. And the reason why is you really shouldn't modify this directly, but let's rebuild. And once we rebuild, it should be that it shows click me for the button 1 name. Let's close it out, open back up. It still doesn't. So what this is illustrating is don't modify the designer. It's not meant to be modified. This is what, it goes one direction. We're modifying it. It should be that we modify it in the designer and then it changes over here. So let's go to our properties window. Notice this property window over here. What does properties sound like? We've had that keyword used before. Well, in a class, we have basically variables, but those variables aren't just a private variable or a public variable. Instead, we use a special thing called a property. We have a full property or an auto property. Well, the reason we call this window the properties window is because it shows the properties of this class instance. Yes, these are the same thing. These are properties of a class. And these are specific properties or properties specific to this particular class instance, the button 1 class instance. So let's change the text. Instead of button 1, let's change the text to hello world. Notice it says hello world here. If we go to our designer should say, and it does, hello world. We're changing the name, not the text. That's why. And we can't change the name here. So we've now changed the text right here to hello world. The tab index is 0. The use visual style back color is true, and we have a click event. These are things that have been changed from the default because each property has a default value. If we look at this button, notice that we didn't see a value for tag. There isn't one. There isn't one over here that says tag. But if I put something in tag, and tag is just a placeholder. It's just a thing where you can store information if you want to that's not displayed anywhere. It's just a way to associate data with this object. So let's just say the tag is 1, 2, 3, 4. Notice, and it's kind of hard to see, but they've bolded 1, 2, 3, 4. Notice how true is not quite as bold as 1, 2, 3, 4 is? That's because this value has changed from the default. That's the way to tell. If we come back over to the designer, we now see that button1.tag equals 1, 2, 3, 4. That's the value. So all of these are properties of that button instance. So let's rename this. The name is, notice it's in parens here. Let's rename this to something else. And I encourage you to always rename your buttons or other things you drag out of the form. Always rename them. Don't keep anything with a 1 at the end, or a 2 or a 3. Always rename it to something significant. Remember, this is a variable name, which means it's not a property name, it's a variable name, which means it gets the camel case. So let's call this the Hello World button. It didn't change anything visually, but now it's called Hello World button. If we go to our designer, notice it's this.hello world button, and this.hello world button equals. And so the name reflects the actual instance name. So that's how we name our items. We want to rename them in the designer, in the parens name section, with a more friendly variable name. Now I want to show you something. The name of this method is Hello World. The name of this instance is Hello World button. If we go to our dashboard, notice it says button1_click. Why does it say button1 and not Hello World button_click? The reason why is because we created this method, this event handler, before we renamed our button. So in order to change this, we would have to do one of a few things. Probably the easiest thing to do to rename this is to come back over to our designer, go to our events, which let's zoom in here. So we'll zoom in on this. Okay, so this is the properties window, but that's kind of a misnomer because yes, it's properties, and that's what this icon indicates here is properties. But it also has the events for the instance as well. So we click on events. Now this is the event list. These are all the things you could assign a method to and listen for. So if we look here, right now we have button1_click for the click event. But we have other events in here. For example, you could really annoy users with the mouse enter event. Whenever the mouse goes over that button, something can happen. You can fire an event. Or when the mouse leaves, or when it hovers, and there's just a whole lot of other things you could do. But by default, for a button, the default event is the click event. What you can do is you can delete it from here. Now that's not associated with that event. We've taken off that event handler. Now we go back to the code. Even that code is gone. Now if we had written code inside that method, that code would not be gone. But because it was empty, Visual Studio said, yeah, I'm pretty sure you want to delete that, so I'll go ahead and do it for you. So now we could come back over here and either double click or double click over here. A double click creates the default event for that instance type. So for the button, the event is the click event. For the label, it would be the click event. And for the form, it looks like it might be the click event too. Let's try double clicking the form. Nope, it's the load event. So dashboard_load event. And to come back over here to our dashboard, notice we have this load event now because that's the default for the dashboard or for the form. I'm going to delete that out. Come back to my button, and this time I'm going to double click on the over here in the click event. Notice there's no events, but if I double click in here, it creates the Hello World button_click. Also notice that my button is named Hello World Button, but it's a lowercase h. But over here, it's a uppercase H. Well, why did it do that? Visual Studio knows the standard conventions. And the standard convention for a variable is camel case. But the standard convention for a method is Pascal case, meaning every word gets a capital first letter. So since this is a method, even though it wants to use the name of our private variable, it says, let's give that a Pascal casing. So it capitalizes the H. So hello world button underscore click. And the underscore click indicates this is the event type. It's the click event. So which button, what event. So it's pretty easy to read what's going on, as long as you have named your button first. That's why one of my best practices is all the different objects on my form, and they all have names that are readable and understandable. So now when I go to this event, I can read and go, oh, that's the hello world button. Gotcha. And that's the click event. So what's going to happen in here? Well, let's create a message box. And a message box is just a thing that pops up and it has a message in it. So we're going to say messagebox.show. And this is just really simple. You can say hello world. This is a really simple way of giving users information in a pop-up. So with nothing else done, we can run this. And once it comes up, we can click on hello world and it pops up and it says hello world. And it's got an OK button. We hit OK and it's gone. Interpolation and put, instead of world, put some kind of first name here. But what do we put in these curly braces? Well, we have this thing called first name text. That's our class instance. And inside there, we have a property called text. Gets or sets the text associated with this control. Well, that property just so happens to hold the value of this field. So with that, just referring to just that instance and that property, I can run this. And when it pops up, I can put Tim in here and click Hello World. And this box pops up and it says Hello Tim. So now I have accessed the properties of a instance from inside my C# code. Again, how does it know about first name text? We have it over here. We have first name text, but how does it know about it in our code? Remember that our code is a partial class, and it combines with another partial class, that partial class being the designer. And the designer, if we look in here, it assigns a variable. In fact, we come down here at the very bottom, we have a private variable for 4 different things. And one of those private variables, this one right here, is of type system.windows.forms.textbox. And it is named first name text. And then we use that throughout. So here's this control add this dot first name text. Up here, the first name text properties are being set. And up here, we instantiate first name text to be a new instance of text box. So this private variable right here, we can use in our other half of our class, which is over here. So first name text, we can access the property, the text property. We can also set that value. So after we pop this message box up, I can say first name text.text equals empty string. Let's run this. And it pops up, and I say hello, Tim. Hello world. Notice the box is right here. I hit OK. It's still filled, but if I hit OK, it's now empty because that code gets run after the message box has been closed. So the message box kind of pauses the code right here, and then once it's closed, then it runs this code. This is synchronous code. This is not asynchronous, meaning it runs and it pauses until we're done that line, then it goes to the next one. So hopefully by this point, you've been practicing your object-oriented programming quite a bit, and you're fairly comfortable with things like classes and instantiation, and even inheritance. So let's focus in on the things that make Windows Forms more unique and kind of the best practices around Windows Forms. So let's first, if I click and drag, I can highlight a section. Notice the purple line. That allows me to select multiple items at once. I can move those around. That allows me to also drag my form to be tighter, like so. Now, Windows Forms, one of the downsides of Windows Forms is that everything is a fixed position. As you saw earlier, we had those points, and they indicate, okay, here's where this object lives. This is the spot that it lives. And it's all based upon a grid. So if you make this bigger, well, all you're doing is getting more formula state. You're not actually changing where these controls live. There's no out-of-the-box responsiveness to how this works. You have to do some modifications to make it grow and shrink like a web page does. So that's one of the downsides. The other downside is that this all runs off the CPU, the central processing unit. It does not use the graphics card unless you have third-party controls that use the graphics card. But by default, it does not use the graphics card. What that means is it's harder to do things that take graphic power. So live video and even lots of images can cause problems for a Windows form because it's running through the CPU, not the graphics card. So the graphics card is not taking any work away. So just kind of note that in the back of your head. That's the downsides of Windows Forms. The upsides are you saw how fast and easy it was to create this form. Even with me monkeying around and playing with things, I was putting things on pretty quick, and we've got the start of a form. So it's really easy to get a form up and running. If you need a prototype app, a Windows form is a great way of doing it because you have that quick GUI where you can just drag a couple things on, rename them, create the events, and off you go. So it's very easy to create an application in just a couple of steps. Let's go to our bin directory real quick. So open folder in File Explorer, and we'll go to our bin debug and look at what it outputs. All right, messagewall.exe. That's the executable for this application. If I were to double click on this, it would run our application without the Visual Studio Debugger. We do have a config file. We have our PDB file. The config file is the app.config. I'll show you that in a little bit, but that's where we store our settings. The PDB file is a file that's used for debugging a production application. It's not something you give users, but it is something that you would store somewhere if you want to debug your application later and attach to this actual application to debug. It's a little more advanced topic. It's not something we'll cover, but just know that's what it's for. All right, let's zoom back out here and let's talk through some more form-specific stuff. So if we select this form itself and go to Properties, one of the properties up here is the font. Notice how tiny these fonts are. And that's because by default, the font is Microsoft Sans Serif 8.25 point. That's ridiculously tiny. If I click the ellipsis next to it, it comes up. I don't know why the default font is 8 point. I really think the default font should be something more like 18 point because it just makes it a lot more visible. Web pages are already talking about 16 point at least, if not 18 point for fonts, because it just makes it easier to read, and it also encourages you to put less text on one page. Let's just keep it at Microsoft Sans Serif regular 18 point. Notice the form gets a whole lot bigger, and now our buttons have gotten bigger. Let's undo that for a minute. They're all small, and if I change the font to be 18 point, they all get bigger and they all have bigger fonts. Now, that's really helpful because I've just said the default for this form should be 18 point font and it changed all of my items. But what if they don't all change? Let me demonstrate. I'm going to undo this. I'm going to go to Hello World and let's change this to be, bold. Now let's go back to our form and go, oh, you know what? We want to change that to be 18 point font across the board. Whoops. What happened there with Hello World? Well, what happened is because Hello World already had a value set for the font, it didn't want to overwrite that. So therefore, it kept the value that it was. So let's change this manually to 18 point font. And let's turn off that bold. Okay. So the point here is that when you're setting up a form, there's some order to how you do it. First of all, before you do anything with a new form, set up your default font first. That way, everything gets that font, and that's where it starts from. And then you can work from there to make any changes you want. Next, whenever you put something on a form, make sure the first thing you do is go to the top and change that name in parens, change that to your variable name for that particular item, and name it something clear and understandable. Because when you're in your code behind, you want to be able to know what properties you're accessing on which instances of your items. So first name text makes it very clear what that is. It's the first name text. Okay, so make sure you're clear on that. If you have button 1, button 2, text box 1, it's hard to know if you're using the right one, and that leads to errors. It also just makes your code that much harder to read. And remember, code is meant to be read by humans. The compiler has no problem with button 1 and button 2 and button 3. It knows which each one is. But humans have a much harder time understanding which one is button 1 and button 2. So that's the order of things. The first thing you do is change your font size. The next thing you do is whenever you put anything on the form, immediately rename it. So those are some good practices that you can do for this. Now let's modify our form a little bit. I'm going to delete goodbye. Don't need that. I'm going to move hello world down here. And you know what? Nope, I'm going to delete this too. And we're going to, I'm going to delete everything. It's all going. Why not? And if we go our code behind, just to make sure we don't have any code sitting out here, we do. We have hello world button underscore click, but it's not being used by anything. And of course, you have errors because there's no more first name text. But let's delete that manually. And you may have panicked and say, wait, Tim, but you can't do that yet because that's a event handler. Well, no, it's not anymore because that button is gone and it doesn't affect anything. Okay, go to our toolbox. We'll pin this in. Notice how with our properties and our toolbox, we've now started to pin things open. We have less real estate to actually work. So I try and do my drag and drop first and then unpin. So let's do this. We have our form. We have it. We have the font changed. Now let's go to our common controls. This is the one I live in mostly. Let's put a label up here and we'll rename this label to be message label. And let's go ahead and change the text to be message. And notice it doesn't change the mouse out of it. So now it changes. Let's grab a text box. And if I move this over, notice the blue line. That's saying that these two are aligned at the top. And there's then a blue line at the bottom. These two are aligned at the bottom. But then there's a pink line. And that pink line says that the text of the label will line up, the bottom of the text of the label will line up with the bottom of the text in the text box. That's ideal. There's also a little blue line in the middle right now that indicates that it's a standard width away from that label. So you can drop it right there. So these little controls are pretty helpful. Let's expand it. And now I'm going to rename this text box from text box 1 to something else. And this is the message text. And if you ever wonder if you have renamed everything properly, just do a drop down in your properties window and look for any object there that has a 1 at the end. All right, now we're going to add a list box. I'm going to align that, left align that with the messages label. I'm going to drag this out like so. It does snap to that edge where the message text ends, but it doesn't show a line for it when you're expanding it. Oh, there it does. Got it. And now I can rename this. Notice it says listbox1 in it. A list box is just a box with a list of items inside of it. We'll top align it, and we will bottom align it as well. And we'll call it butt. Nope, let's call it button. But the first thing I do is rename it. So add message. Notice I don't have to put button at the end of it because that's the action it's going to do is add the message. And we'll say add. There we go. And now we can decide if you want to move this over to here or not. I think not. I think we'll leave it just like it is. And we'll move this a little closer. And let's just call that good for right now. We'll move our form to kind of wrap around it a little better. Let's actually tweak this just a little. Like so. And so you can kind of grab these things, move them around, and kind of get to where you feel it looks pretty nice. The other thing you can do is notice this form has a kind of a grayish, I'm not even sure what color that is, background. That doesn't always look the greatest. You can come down to background color, which right now is control. You could change it to a darker like this right here, or even maybe even darker like dark or control dark dark. That actually makes things pop out a little bit more, especially if we change these two to be white. Or what we can do is go the opposite direction, go to the web and go with white. Have a white form. And that can look nice as well. So it's up to you how you want to make this look. I am not a great visual designer. I am more of a code person, but I can at least point you in the right direction. And that's a good place to start is the back color. So now that I have that set, now what I can do is I can start wiring this up. Because we have everything renamed. That's good. We have all the values we need. Therefore, we can unpin the toolbox. We can even unpin the properties and even shrink this down a little bit as well. And now we have more real estate for our designer and for our code. So what's this going to do? Well, whenever a person types a message in here, they hit add, it's going to go on the list in this list box. So now we have to create the code to support this form. So the first thing we need is we need a list to hold all those messages. I'm going to put this list outside of the constructor, but inside this class. Therefore, it's going to be a private variable that anything inside this class can use and that lives for the lifespan of the class. So if I'm going to be explicit about it, I'd say private, or I can just call it list. Because list, by default, any object that's not specifically given a modifier, an access modifier, is by default private inside of a class. So this is now private. So private list, we're going to keep it simple and go private list of string. And say messages equals new list of string messages. Okay, so this is a simple list that has messages on it. And we are going to fill this up as we have messages. Well, how do we associate this list with this list? Well, what we do is we can do it in the constructor, or we can do it in our own method. And I typically create a private method. Private void wire up lists, like so. And then I call it after initialize components. Now, why after initialize components? Well, if you remember, when we looked at the initialize components, one of the things it did, the very first thing, is it created new instances of all of our items on our form and assigned them. So until this point, they were not newed up. They had no instance in them. Therefore, we can't use the label, the text box, the list box, the label, or the button until after they're instantiated, which happens inside initialize components. Therefore, call this first before you do anything else. Okay, to wire up the lists, what we're going to say is that list box, which is message list box, and we have a data source. This is where the data comes from for this message list box. And the data comes from messages. Cool. That's it. So now, whenever we add something to the list, it's going to display on this list. Well, no, not really. Okay? Because if we add something to the list, it doesn't tell this list box, hey, there's new stuff here, go and get it. So instead of using the list type, we have to use a special type called a binding list. It operates in a lot of ways almost identically to a list, but it has the added feature of telling people when it's changed. So with just that change, now whenever the messages list gets added to or has things removed from it, it will tell the message list box, hey, I've changed. Go ahead and display the changes. Now we can wire up this button here, the add button. I just double clicked on it to create the event. And in here, what we can do is say the messages dot add. We're going to add a new item to the list, and that new item is going to be the message text dot text. This is one of those rookie mistakes right here. In theory, you could do this. Well, you can't really because it doesn't have a toString, or does not convert to a toString. It's not calling it specifically. But message text is the actual instance of the class, not the specific text value. That's the dot text. So the one property you want out of this class is the text property. Next, let's say message text.text equals empty string. And finally, I'm going to message text.set focus. Not set focus, just focus. And what that will do is it will put the cursor back in the message box. That way we can push the button, type, and tab over, hit the button, and keep going. So let's see how this works in action. So once this compiles and starts, I'll drag it over, and we have the cursor up here. If we tab, notice it goes down here and then to the add. That's when our tab order is out of order. We'll get to that in a minute. But for now, Tim, add. Notice the cursor is back over here. Testing, add. The cursor's back, and now we have a second item in the list. So it keeps adding things to the list whenever we click this button. Now you can click a button by tabbing over to it. Notice the dots around it right now. Let's zoom in here a little bit more. See that the dotted line around it? That indicates on these labels. That's because by default, the tab stop doesn't even have a tab stop has a tab index, but no tab stop. Okay, so tab stop is set to true. If you'd set it to false, then it wouldn't stop there. So for example, maybe you don't want it to stop here. You just turn that off. But let's first change our tab index. The tab index counts up and it says that this is the order in which we're going to do tabbing. So right now it's 1 for this box, 2 for the list box, and 3 for the button. Well, you don't have to keep it exactly sequentially. Meaning, if I wanted to, I could set this value to 20. That's cool. And in fact, that will work the way I expect it to or want it to, which is we're going to go from 1 to 3 to 20. Now, is that efficient? It's not great from a designer standpoint, but as through the other 3, but that's a way to quickly move around your form and modify things. Okay, so the tab order should be fixed. So if we hit F5 to run this and we come over here, we can now tab to the button and then tab the list box and then back to the text box. And if we want to turn off that list box, we could set the tab stop to be false. If we run this again, whoops, there we go. If I tab from the text box over to the button, if I tab again, I'm back in the text box because there's nothing else to tab to. You can still mouse over here and select it. You just can't tab to it. And that can be really helpful when you're modifying your forms. Now let's work on the message, the blank message in our box. So right now we just add that message to the list as long as, well, just whenever. So let's do this. Let's Control X here to cut those lines out. We're going to say if the message text.text, if string.is null or white space on the message text.text. So if it's null or white space, then we're going to do something different. But otherwise, we're going to do our original code, which is to add the message and to clear that box out. So if it's null or white space, meaning they haven't typed anything in here, then what we'll do is, let's say message box dot show, and we'll do a little more advanced message box this time. So we're going to have some text. Notice the overloads. There's 21 overloads here. We're going to have some text. We're going to have a caption. And we're going to have some buttons. And then let's also have an icon. So we're going to do overload number 7. So first we have the text. And the text is going to be, you did not, actually no, let's say, please enter a message before trying to add it to the list. And then after that, we'll hit comma and hit enter, and we'll have a caption. And the caption is going to be blank message field. And then we have buttons. And you may say, well, what buttons? Well, if I hit space, it says message box buttons. If I hit tab and then dot, it's an enum, and it allows me to choose which type of buttons to use. Do I want a abort, retry, ignore? Do I want OK, cancel? Do I want yes, no? Well, in this case, I actually just want OK, which was the default, but I have to specify it now. Now if I hit comma again, message box icon. Notice the IntelliSense comes up with message box buttons. But that's not right. I want message box icon. And I hit dot. And now I have the different options. Asterisk, error, exclamation, hand, information, none, question, stop, and warning. Well, let's go with error. And now I hit my semicolon. So all I'm going to do is show a message box. I'm not going to add the text to the list. I'm not going to clear it out. But I am going to set the focus back on that field. Let's try that. So now let's type in test, hit add, and hello world, and hit add, and goodbye, and hit add. Notice how quickly this goes because I'm using my keyboard only, no mouse. So I'm typing my message, I hit tab and then space, and it adds it in, and it brings that cursor back. This is one of the things that you need to think about when you're designing an application, is especially where you have users putting a lot of information in or putting information in a lot. So either lots of different pieces of information or similar information but lots of them. You want to design a system that makes their life as easy as possible, allows them to go faster and faster and faster. And one of the ways to do that is to design it so that they can use their keyboard without having to use their mouse. And so these type of controls are very nice for things like that. And then changing the tab order, the tab index, and turning off the tab stop on items you don't want them to go to, or they don't need to go to. And they can still click down here, but that way they can quickly add items to the list. Now let's just say they went to add something and they got so quick that they tabbed over with nothing in the box, hit add. And it pops up with this error message that says blank message field. It's got the red X icon, and it says please enter a message before trying to add to the list. You go, oh, whoops, I forgot to do that. You hit OK. The cursor is back so I can just start typing. And there we go. So with those minor tweaks, we can alert the user to problems, we can allow them to enter information very fast, and we can still give them a good, rich experience. Now, before we wrap up, I do want to point out a couple of things real quick. One of them is this message box right here, this message list box. I just assigned this list to it, and that's all I did. And that works just fine with a list or a binding list of string. Where it'd have a problem is if I assign it a binding list of, say, person model. What you would see instead of, let's say, first name and last name, what you'd see instead is you would see the person model class name over and over and over again. And the reason why is because with this list box, what it does is it takes the objects that are inside of it and it says, just print the string version of what's ever in there. Well, that's not a problem when you have a list of string. But when you have a list of object, a toString on an object is the object's full name. So a toString on the dashboard class would be messagewall.dashboard. And that's not exactly something easily readable. Doesn't provide any value to us. So instead, you have to provide a display member. So you would say, right down here in the wire up lists, you would say message list box dot display member, and then you give it a property name inside, and it's a string property name. So if you had, let's say, first name, you wanted to assign that property, if this is a list of object, not a list of string, you could say the first name property, read that. But notice how it's a string, and that's kind of ugly. So instead what you do is say name of, and then put your property name. So dashboard dot, I'm not sure if we have what properties we have in here, but let's say, the icon. Cool. So that would be how you'd assign the icon property as the name to display, the property to display. And it's going to do a toString on the icon property, which that wouldn't work. But we could do text. There we go. So do the text of the dashboard. But in this case, if you had a list of person model, you'd say person model dot first name, and take that property and display that for each of the members. And now it's going to say Tim, Joe, Sally, Mary, Sue. Okay? And we'll get into that more when we get into the homework. I just want to point that out. The other thing I want to point out is there's an awful lot of controls in this toolbox, and I haven't touched on hardly any of them. We've done the basics. I mean, we have a label, we have a text box, we have a button, and we have a list box. But there's things like a combo box. Well, guess what? First of all, combo box and a list box, same exact thing. It's just that one collapses down and the other one doesn't. So as far as controlling them goes, it's the same thing. Date picker, we haven't covered that. How about the progress bar? Haven't covered it. Radio button, haven't covered it. Why haven't I covered all of these, and am I going to in this course? And the answer to the second part is no, I'm not going to cover them. And here's why. There are an enormous number of controls, but what it comes down to is controls are just classes, and those classes have properties. And all you need to do is find out what properties are set on a certain control, and you're all good. What controls you need will be different than what controls basics, and we'll have our next lesson is actually a mini project building a Windows Form application. And so we'll cover a couple more probably, and a couple more things that we're going to need to do with Windows Forms. But again, what it comes down to is Windows Forms is just a bunch of classes and properties and methods. And of course, we've added in events now. But that's really all it is. And so if you take that mindset and you realize, hey, that's all this is, then it makes it much easier to figure out how to work with whatever class that you need to add to your form. Okay? So there is going to be some work on your part. That's just how it is. This is not a deep dive intensive on Windows Form, because we'd be here for months going through everything there is. And we have other project types to get to. But just know that just find that little piece that you need and then add it to your skills that you already have. But start here. Start by learning Windows Forms itself. Just remember that Windows Forms is mostly for either legacy development or quick development. Development where you're trying something out and you get an application up and running fast. It's generally not used as much anymore for full production apps that are new. There's a ton of existing legacy applications out there that use Windows Forms. So it's definitely something good to learn. But also note that, and we're going to cover this again and again with other user interfaces, people get hung up on the idea that a user interface is the code. And they think, okay, teach me how to do this stuff. And I want to know more about this. This is just a skin for code. The user interface is just about display. The actual code itself is C#. And so if you have a good foundation in C#, then the user interface that you choose isn't a big deal. So that's why we've not covered the various user interfaces until Module 7. Because I wanted to get you a good foundation in C# itself. Hopefully you didn't skip ahead to this point, because you've missed out on a whole lot of foundational work that led up here, and you've probably gotten lost if you did, because there's a lot of stuff that you have to know about C#. So in the following lessons, we're going to cover other user interface types, such as WPF or ASP.NET MVC, and so on. Those other user interface types are just the front end. And you'll notice some commonalities because of the fact that they're all powered by C# and they're all basically just a bunch of classes, properties, methods, and events. And if you follow my YouTube channel, you've probably seen people ask the question, or maybe even you've asked the question, well, how do I do this in Windows Forms? And the common one is, how do I do data access in Windows Forms? And my answer typically is the same way you do data access in MVC or WPF or any other user interface. Because data access is C# code. And so the way you call C# code in one project is the same as the way you call it in another project. And so just keep that in the back of your mind as we're learning these user interfaces, that this is just display and behind it is C# code. The other thing I note is that this code right here, this code behind for the form, it's awful tempting to put all of your code behind this form. So you have your logic and you have your data access right here, which we haven't covered data access yet. We'll get there. That's the next module. But it's tempting to put all your code right here. Don't do that. Put all of your code that's not not user interface specific, put all that code into a class library. That way you can change out your user interface with little or no effort. So make sure that you don't put code in here that's not user interface specific. Now all this code pretty much is. So right here, messagebox.show, that's user interface. This right here, technically that's not necessarily user interface. All that list is specific to the user interface. So it probably is user interface code. It's accessing the user interface to get this property and to clear it out and to set the focus. These are all user interface things. But just don't slip into that habit of then putting logic in your code behind as well. Move anything you can over to the class library. Okay, so there we go. That is your lesson on Windows Forms. Let's look at our tip for today, and that is to get to know Windows Forms because they're easy and they're still in use. And that's a key point here. A lot of people say, well, they're so old that no one uses them. And people who say that haven't been around the industry because there are a lot of businesses that still use Windows Forms applications. Now, yes, some businesses don't. It depends on the age of the business and how up to date and modern their software developers are. But think of it this way. If a business had a cutting edge application in, let's say, 2002 that they started building, and they spent 5 years really making this application great. So this is now 2007, and it's a Windows Form application. They've got 1,000,000+ lines of code in it, and it runs their business great. And as they progress through the years, they continue to make this application even better. Well, at what point do they say, okay, let's throw this away and start over? They don't, because they've got too much invested in this application. Now, if they coded it correctly, which you'll find that most businesses don't do, because most programmers don't do, but if they code it in a loosely coupled manner, they can replace just that user interface and it wouldn't be as much work. But still, let's just say you've got 200 forms with all these different custom controls. How are you going to replace that? That's a lot of investment for essentially getting the same product out the other end. And so it doesn't happen because the company needs to move forward, not just have stuff behind the scenes be better. Because the boss wants more and more things done and wants progress that's visible and visual, not just say, oh, well, our back-end application has been updated. And so the application stays running in Windows Forms, probably for the lifetime of the application, which gets longer and longer because the organization can't afford to replace it. And so Windows Forms are essential. You need to know Windows Forms because you may find yourself in a business that has these applications in it that are powered by Windows Forms. So they're very easy to use and they are still in use. But don't stay there. And so what I'm saying is, yes, learn them. They're important. But don't just say, okay, now that I've learned them, I'm going to stay right here and just stick with Windows Forms because they're awesome and they're easy. And they are both of those things, but they are not the way to develop a modern desktop application. So don't just stay there. Okay? So that's your pro tip for today. Let's look at the homework. The homework is to build a WinForms application that has a simple data entry screen. The data entry screen should have a first and last name field. So you have first name, you have a last name. Fill both of those in and have a button say, hi, Tim Corey, first and last name. So hi, Tim Corey, when pressed, or hi, Jill Jones, or whatever you put in for first and last name. Maybe put some logic in there too to make sure that the first name and last name fields are filled in. And maybe if they're not, move the cursor to the field that is incorrect. So if they put a first name but no last name, move the cursor to the last name field and say, hey, you need to fill in a last name. And if the last name is filled in but not the first name, move the cursor to the first name field and say, hey, you need to enter a first name. Okay? And get all that to work. We've done most of this code already. In fact, I think we've done pretty much all the code you need already. It's just rearranging it in the ways that apply to this particular homework assignment. So get that done. If you have any questions, look back at the video. You'll see examples of how to do the different pieces that you need. Put them together. Once you have that done and working, then move on to the next lesson.